In tonight's Dateline Defense, cybersecurity concerns bring the world's two biggest economies together. The Chinese defense minister made a rare trip to the U.S. this week. General Liang Guangli held a press conference with U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. They pledged cooperation in the field of cyber warfare. Will that really work? Joining me tonight for some insight is Cedric Leighton. He's a military intelligence officer, retired U.S. Air Force colonel, and the president of Cedric Leighton Associates. Talk about the fox watching the hen house. Are we actually going to get some cooperation with China over cybersecurity issues? I thought they were the problem and not the solution.
Well, Morris, you're right. They are actually the problem. And so it was very interesting to watch General Liang and his press conference with Secretary Panetta. It really spoke about, you'd have to say Chinese chutzpah in actually saying that they weren't effective at doing any cyber attacks against the U.S. and that they were not the primary attacker of the U.S. That actually is not correct. They are among the primary attackers between China, Russia, and other countries. We are pinged at least 50,000 times a day in our defense networks, and that is a clear indication that they are actively seeking to go after us.
Virginia Representative Randy Forbes targeted the Chinese military specifically. In April, he introduced a bill in the House Armed Services Committee that included this language: Beijing's continued lack of transparency, its regard for the United States as its principal strategic adversary, forces uncertainty in its long-term intentions. So should we design our counterintelligence with China's help or to prevent Chinese breaches then?
Well, really what we need to do is we need to prevent Chinese breaches. The Chinese can't help us design our own security, nor would they want us to design their security. Right. The countries are basically militarily incompatible with each other. Although we need to work together to avoid a major conflict, what needs to happen is that we need to design our cybersecurity systems with the threat in mind. That threat comes from China.
Well, why this meeting then? Is it there's the old adage of keep your enemies close. That's all I can see what we would get from it by trying to do some cooperative agreement with China.
Well, there was more than just the cybersecurity piece, so it was very important for them to meet in order to avoid misunderstandings in terms of general military operations.
You've got to communicate. It's when people don't talk that things go wrong.
Exactly.
So that's true.
Exactly. And this whole process involving cybersecurity really boils down to us trying to work with them and trying to really mitigate the threat without having to go to a large expense of going after individual pieces of malware or botnets that come from China. So it's one of those efforts where we're trying to work it diplomatically, trying to work it face-to-face with the Chinese, but that will be a long process, and it'll be a process that will require a lot of engagement between us and them before it can ever be realized.
Now, what's happening on Capitol Hill? Joe Lieberman has a cybersecurity bill. It's kind of stuck. Republicans don't like it. Why?
Well, some Republicans don't like it because they look at it as being too intrusive. They believe that what it will do is it will force the providers of some of the critical infrastructure, such as water, sewage systems, communication systems, banks, to comply with new federal restrictions and federal regulations. There are other Republicans and Democrats that look at it from a civil liberties standpoint. So the upshot is that Senator Lieberman does not have 60 votes to pass his version of the cybersecurity legislation. There's other legislation that passed the House that was sponsored by the Republican chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, but that will not be considered by the Senate because the Democrats don't want to support a Republican bill that went through the whole House process.
Does everybody have good intentions? Are there lobbyists involved, a trail of money someplace, or is this totally just on the ethics and the theoretical aspects of cybersecurity?
Well, there are always lobbyists involved in these issues, Morris, and part of the issue here is that there are some vested interests. The business community, to include the American Chamber of Commerce, has decided that it does not support the Lieberman bill because they believe that it is too intrusive and too restrictive on business. The problem that you run into, though, is if you do not have a set of standards or a set of requirements for critical infrastructure, then the protection will be haphazard and it will be less effective against attacks from foreign entities, be they state-sponsored entities or hackers, and that's where the difficulty lies.
Now, you mentioned the power and water plants. What is the Republicans' concern, again, about the power and water plants?
Well, basically, the concern that the Republicans have in this particular case is that all of these critical infrastructure pieces will be forced to abide by even further government regulation. And so their point of view is basically that we do not need to have as much government regulation. We can rely on voluntary cooperation between businesses and the government in order to achieve the same ends.
Now let's shift our focus to a standoff in Southeast Asia. What's going on between China, the Philippines, and the Spratlys?
Well, the Spratly Islands are a chain of islands that really a bunch of coral reefs in many cases between Vietnam, the Philippines, and China. The area is laid claim to by not only China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, but also Cambodia, Brunei, Malaysia. All of these countries want to go after resources that they think lie under the ocean floor in the Spratlys. So there's this particular reef in the Spratlys called the Scarborough Shoal, and there's been a standoff between the Chinese, who have claimed that particular shoal, as well as the Philippines. The Philippines have sent naval vessels, as have the Chinese, and the Chinese have actually threatened armed conflict over the Scarborough Shoal, which is a very, very small piece of real estate in the South China Sea. What that risks is a confrontation that involves a U.S. ally, the Philippines, against China, and I don't think anybody in Washington really wants that conflict to accelerate or to get into a hot war over a very small piece of real estate.
Reminds me of the Falklands years ago. You know, almost, but we don't want to. China's just an emerging, it has been emerging for quite some time, and you've got to be watching your back every second.
Absolutely.
Cedric Leighton, how can we follow you?
Well, you can follow me at Twitter, on Twitter at Cedric Leighton, and you can also follow me on LinkedIn. And it's you know, it's one of those areas where we'll soon be expanding into a website as well, in Cedric Leighton Associates.
When Anonymous is not hacking into you.
That's right.
You offer a lot of information. You also upset a lot of black hatters out there too. Cedric Leighton, our guest on Capital Insider. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Morris.